Hello, my name is Mike Bell from Gender Parity UK, and this little video is about myths which support the anti-male narrative. So what is the anti-male narrative? Well, it's a series of untruths which support the idea that men and masculinity are dangerous and that women need special protection. So here's the anti-male narrative supported with these myths. And what we need to do is demolish the myths which support the narrative. So these are the myths we're going to cover. That modern feminists just want equality. That there's a gender pay gap. That we live in a patriarchy with male privilege. That masculinity itself is toxic. That females are the overwhelming majority of victims of domestic abuse. The Duluth Model, or the power and control wheel, explaining violence, and that suffragettes needed to be militant in order to get the votes for women. So the purpose of this video is to help you dispel the myths. If the truth becomes widely known, the narrative can't survive. So here's the first myth. Feminists just want equality. Equality feminists in the 1970s just wanted a level playing field. They wanted to be able to go to university and compete on an equal basis. Equality was achieved. Votes by 1920. Equal pay achieved in 1970. And there were equal numbers of men and women at university by 1993. Now there are far more women than men at university. But somehow or other, radical feminists claim patriarchy and oppression. They do this by cherry-picking the evidence. For instance, they highlight that there are more men who are MPs or chief executives or whatever, people in high-up posts. But what they ignore is that a lot of men are doing cold, wet, and dangerous jobs that women don't want to do anyway. And they also ignore the fact that women are dominating in other professions like teaching and nursing and psychology. And then there's the myth of the gender pay gap. This is usually undefined, and it implies that women are paid less than men for the same job. But that's been illegal since 1970, and no such evidence is ever produced. It's actually an earnings gap. It's the difference in average earnings between male and female employees at a particular business. But it's actually about choices, not about oppression or these are some of the choices that people make. I mean, it's the qualifications or the experience or the amount of overtime or unsocial hours or the continuity of employment or the danger of the job. Let's just take a look at an example of an airline, for instance. There are more men who are pilots and engineers, and these tend to be highly paid. They require a lot of experience and qualifications, whereas there are more women who are cabin staff and check-in staff. Now, these are choices that people make. There isn't anything to stop women becoming pilots or engineers. It's just that they choose to do things which fit in with their lifestyle better. And the next myth is that we live in a patriarchy, that it's all about male privilege. The idea here is that UK society is organized by men for men's benefit, and that consequently women need positive action. And it's also used as a term of abuse. And it undermines the concept of father as provider and protector in the family. But there's endless data which disproves this. We have a lot of it on our website. Do have a look. There's a link below this video. The next myth is that masculinity itself is toxic. It implies that there's something inherently bad about masculinity. And they also seem to assume that it's a training given to boys by men, because people use terms like harmful gender stereotypes as though they've been trained into these stereotypes. And that men and boys therefore need some sort of therapy or re-education to make them into decent citizens. But it's not toxic masculinity. Both men and women can be toxic. It's the behavior which is toxic. And of concern is the fact that bad behavior by boys is more common where they have a single parent mother. That is, when there's no positive male role model or mentor at home. And of course, it ignores all the good that men do to say that masculinity is toxic. The next myth is that females are the overwhelming majority of victims of domestic abuse. This implies that the number of male victims is so small that no resources are needed. But already 99% of refuge places and funding goes to female victims. Of course, they deserve it. They should have funding and refuge places. But the Office of National Statistics says that 35% of the victims are male. So for 1% of the funding and places to go to 35% is unfair. And so then for people to act as though females are the overwhelming majority is unfair. Then we have to look at the Duluth model, or the power and control wheel. The idea here is that all the violence against women by men is motivated by hatred of women, that it's an attempt to exercise power and control over them. Unfortunately, the evidence doesn't support that. For instance, in domestic abuse, 60% of it is mutual couple violence. So it's an argument that's got out of control. And this wheel has been widely disproved by researchers and even disowned by one of its originators. And yet it's still in use and cited as evidence by our government. And finally, the myth that suffragettes needed to be militant in order to get votes for women. But let's have a look at the history. Suffragists were formed in 1897, and they were always peaceful demonstrations, very big organization throughout the country. Suffragettes came later, 1903, and they used terror tactics such as arson and bombing. However, by 1905, there was already a majority in favor of votes for women in the House of Commons. 400 out of 650 MPs had already declared in favor. But unfortunately, poor old Prime Minister Asquith had a majority of only one. And the suffragists and the suffragettes were only asking for votes for property-owning women, and the Liberal Prime Minister thought he might lose the election because these new women voters would vote Conservative, and so he put things off. And then the war came, and in 1919, the vote was granted to all men. I mean, they were coming back from the trenches. It was a bit harsh for them to have fought for their country and then come back to no votes. And the vote was also given to most women at that time. However, the idea that this militancy was needed because men opposed women's votes is just not only not historically correct, but women's votes were achieved in the United States or in New Zealand and in dozens of other places with no militancy at all. So please challenge the myths, spot them when they arise, challenge the journalist or the politician, ignore the radicals, you'll never get anywhere with them. And use the information on our website and elsewhere. Tell others about the myth. Because if we have an anti-male narrative supported by myths, then if we can dispel the myths, maybe the anti-male narrative will fade away. Of course, that's wishful thinking perhaps, but we can but try. So, here's some resources on our website. Look at Gender Parity UK / myths. You'll find more information and useful videos. Let's do it. Thank you.